Chapter 3. My lowest point and a glimmer of hope. I was sitting at my desk, waiting for our teacher to walk in, when the spit flew from John's mouth and landed on my cheek. John was, in my mind at least, one of the cool kids. He was a rugby player. He was popular and clever too. I, on the other hand, was skinny, uncool, and athletically challenged. The desks all had various unintelligent graffiti etched into them as boys tried to leave their mark through the years. Light streamed in from the two large windows behind me. To the right, behind John and his friend Christopher, were rows of metal lockers where we kept our bags, books, and gym equipment. I wiped the spit off my face and just stared at my desk as John and Christopher watched me and laughed. In that moment, I felt so small, unworthy, and unimportant. It didn't even occur to me to fight back, to say anything, or even report him to the teacher. In fact, even our teacher seemed to adore John. I had few friends, and even though I'd worked for years to get into this top school, my experience now didn't seem much better than when I'd been struggling to get in. But it is often in our lowest moments that we find hope. For me, that hope came in the form of a classmate, Kevin. A few days after the spitting incident, I got into conversation with Kevin and told him what had happened. Kevin said that if John had spat at him, he would have spit right back. This shocked me because Kevin was of a similar size and build to me. What if you got beaten up? I asked him. Kevin was unaffected. He had a confidence I admired, and he was kind too. For some reason, he took me under his wing, introduced me to his friends, and helped to remind me that I didn't need to be so afraid of John. In fact, I didn't need to be so afraid of life. It's amazing the impact a little kindness can have on someone's life. I felt like I had finally been given permission to be myself once more. For the remainder of the school year, I started enjoying school and hanging around with my new friends. I frequently tell my clients, we often underestimate the impact we have on others. It's probably safe to say that neither John nor Kevin really knew at the time what was happening in my head and how I was feeling about their actions. However, that episode left its mark. I tried to be as kind to others as Kevin had been to me. Looking back now, I have no ill will towards John, and he probably can't even remember the event. He was doing what made sense to him in that moment. I'm sure everyone reading this has done things in the past that in hindsight they wouldn't do now. I feel that John and bullies like him are not bad people. They are acting and behaving based on what they think makes sense to them. For my own part, I know that I have been mean, selfish, unkind, and judgmental towards others at times. Does this make me a bad person? I used to think so. However, I think it is a side effect of forgetting who we really are, of forgetting about the part of us which we had greater understanding when we were children. Just like when I was a little boy, kindness has always been with me, just as it is within you. Perhaps what bullies need is not to be shamed or given a taste of their own medicine, but a reminder of who they are. Such an interesting thought, isn't it? I remember several years ago there was a terrible crime committed not far from where we live in Woolwich, and a soldier was attacked and killed. And at the time, it was broad daylight, and it was really was a terrible, terrible thing to happen. But I remember shortly afterwards being on Facebook, I think, and reading comments. And the comments were mostly so full of hate, so full of what should happen to the person who'd committed the crime. And whilst on the one hand, I completely understood it, this poor soldier who wasn't, I don't think even in uniform at the time, had been singled out and murdered by terrorists. So whilst that was terrible, it was awful. It struck me also that the level of hate towards the attacker was very similar to the level of hate the attacker had towards the soldier. And in that moment, I realized at a sort of at an everyday practical level that a lot of the frustration and maybe even anger I had towards with people who I thought had wronged me in the past was only making me suffer. Their lives had probably gone on and they wouldn't even remember, the same as with Ankush and that spitting story. But I was holding on to it. I was holding on to those bad feelings, holding on to those thoughts and unpleasant feelings, and working it into my own life. Even things that had happened years and years ago, I'd still tell them every now and again. They'd still be frequent stories. And so I really saw in that moment how futile trying to find a more peaceful life is if we're holding on to frustration, anger, even though it can seem really, really justified and like the other party really deserves it. Ultimately, the person that suffers is always and only us. See you in the next chapter.